The snowstorm had swallowed the road behind me. I barely had time to react before my car sputtered and died in the middle of nowhere. The fuel gauge shouldn't have been empty. I had filled it up before leaving town. Yet, the needle sat at empty, like something had drained it. I stepped out into the freezing night, pulling my coat tighter around me. The wind howled like a wounded animal, and the snowflakes stung my skin like tiny needles. My phone had no signal. The only light came from the swirling whiteness ahead, reflecting off the endless stretch of snow. But then, just beyond the tree line, I saw it, a cabin. It wasn't visible at first, hidden behind skeletal branches and thick layers of frost. The windows were dark, the wood aged and splintered, yet something about it seemed off. Still, I had no other option. I trudged toward it, my boots crunching in the untouched snow. When I reached the door, I hesitated. There were no footprints leading to it, none at all. I should have been the first to leave any mark, but the area around the cabin was pristine. Still, I knocked. No answer. The storm raged harder, and my body ached from the cold. I tried the handle. It turned easily. The inside smelled like damp wood and something faintly metallic. A fireplace crackled in the corner, casting flickering shadows along the walls. Someone had been here, but the dust-covered floor held no footprints. Not mine, not anyone. I called out, but the silence that followed made my stomach twist. The fire burned warmly, yet there was no sign of who had started it. I took a step forward, feeling like an intruder in something's home. The walls were lined with old, peeling wallpaper, faded beyond recognition. A wooden table sat in the center of the room, and beside it, a single chair faced the fire. Something about that chair unsettled me. I turned away, moving toward a small hallway at the back. 3 doors. The first led to a tiny kitchen, where a kettle sat on a rusted stove, half filled with murky water. The second was a bathroom, the mirror so warped with age that my reflection barely looked human. The third door, locked. A sharp thump sounded from inside. I froze. It had been unmistakable. A dull, heavy sound, like something shifting against the wood. My breath came in short, quick bursts, clouding the air. I reached for the handle and twisted. It resisted at first, then slowly gave way with a groan. The room beyond was dark, too dark. The firelight didn't reach here, swallowed up by an unnatural blackness that made my skin prickle. The only thing I could make out was a bed pushed against the far wall, its sheets tangled and unkempt. But there was something else, a shape sitting on the edge of the bed. It took me a moment to process what I was seeing. A man, or something like a man. His back was turned to me, hunched and still, his head tilted slightly as if listening. My body screamed for me to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. Then, in the silence, a whisper, not from him, from behind me. I spun, but the hallway was empty. The air felt heavy, pressing against my chest like unseen hands. The fire in the main room had dimmed, flickering weakly. My instincts screamed that something was wrong, more than wrong. I turned back to the dark room. The man was gone. The sheets were undisturbed. The room was empty. A gust of wind slammed the door shut, and I stumbled backward, my heart hammering. I wasn't alone. The whispers grew louder, slithering through the walls, coming from beneath the floorboards, from the very air itself. I bolted for the front door. The chair by the fire was now facing me. It had moved. The wind outside had stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. My own ragged breathing felt deafening. I reached for the doorknob, but the metal burned my palm like ice. Then, a voice, low, close. You shouldn't have come. The lights flickered. The walls seemed to breathe, the shadows stretching toward me like grasping fingers. The fireplace roared to life, flames dancing unnaturally high, revealing something, someone standing in the corner. I saw its face, or rather, I didn't. A void stared back at me, where eyes should have been, a mouth that stretched too wide. The whispering became deafening, a chorus of voices screaming inside my skull. My knees buckled, and I slammed my hands over my ears, trying to drown it out. Darkness swallowed the cabin. When I woke up, I was outside, lying in the snow. My car was gone, the road was gone. The cabin stood behind me, dark and silent. The chair still faced the fire, but now there was someone sitting in it, watching, waiting. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to town. I must have walked for hours, maybe days. When I finally reached a gas station, I collapsed inside, barely able to speak. They called the police, but when they drove me back to the location, the cabin was gone. Just trees, just snow. I don't know how I survived that night, but sometimes, in the dead of winter, I swear I can hear the wind whispering my name. The drive through the storm had been a mistake. The highway was nearly invisible under the layers of falling snow, and the wind battered my car with enough force to make me grip the wheel in terror. I was supposed to meet my brother at his cabin, a remote place deep in the mountains, but now I wasn't even sure if I was on the right road anymore. My GPS had lost signal hours ago, and my phone battery was dying fast. I should have turned back. A shape loomed in the distance, barely visible through the sheets of white. At first, I thought it was a person, standing in the middle of the road. My foot slammed the brake pedal, tires skidding across the ice, my breath catching in my throat. But as I got closer, I saw it was something else. A sign. A rusted old wooden sign, half buried in the snow, barely legible through the ice caked onto it. I rolled down my window just enough to brush some of the frost away. The letters beneath were uneven, almost clawed, and "Turn back." My gut twisted. A joke? A warning? It didn't matter. I had nowhere else to go but forward. The storm grew worse. The wind screamed through the trees, and the road ahead blurred into a tunnel of darkness. My headlights barely penetrated the swirling snow. My fingers ached from gripping the wheel too tight. I glanced at my phone, 1% battery. Then, the headlights caught something ahead. A figure. This time it wasn't a sign, it was a man. He stood in the middle of the road, wearing nothing but tattered clothes, his skin sickly pale. His face was gaunt, sunken, his eyes two black pits. He didn't move. He just stared. I slammed the brakes, my heart hammering. But, in the blink of an eye, he was gone. Not like he ran, not like he fell, just gone. The road ahead was empty. I sat frozen, the only sound my own ragged breathing. I wanted to turn around. I wanted to leave. But my car wouldn't move. The engine had died. That was when I heard the knocking. It came from the passenger side window. A slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap. I turned, and for a split second I saw him again. His face too close, pressed against the glass, his mouth opening wider than any human mouth should. Then, total darkness. When I woke up, I was still in my car. The storm had passed. My car was on the side of the road, engine running like nothing had ever happened. But the passenger door was open, and in the seat beside me, there was something resting on the cushion, a single, frost-bitten finger. I never should have taken that shortcut through the mountains. The storm had come out of nowhere, swallowing the road behind me, and my GPS had long since lost signal. The snow piled up too fast, turning the narrow road into an unmarked white abyss. I was completely alone, or so I thought. After what felt like hours of crawling through the storm, my headlights cut through the darkness and landed on a house, a small wooden cabin sitting just off the road, its roof blanketed in thick snow. Light glowed faintly from inside, flickering like an old oil lamp. Relief flooded through me. I pulled over and stepped out, my boots sinking into the snow. The cold bit into my skin and the wind howled through the trees like something alive. I knocked on the door, waiting, silence. I knocked again, harder this time. Then, from inside, a voice, weak, barely above a whisper. "Come in." I hesitated. Something about the voice felt wrong, like it was too soft, too distant. But the cold gnawed at me, and I had no choice. I turned the handle and stepped inside. The cabin was dimly lit by a small fire, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. The place looked abandoned, dust thick on the furniture, old newspapers scattered across the wooden floor. But the strangest part? The footprints, hundreds of them. They covered every inch of the floor, overlapping, crisscrossing in impossible directions. Some were fresh, leading toward the door I had just entered. Others, faded, like they had been there for years. "Shut the door," the voice said again. I turned toward the sound. A figure sat in the corner, barely illuminated by the firelight. It was an old man, wrapped in layers of tattered blankets, his face gaunt and hollow. His eyes, they didn't reflect the fire. They were just empty. "You shouldn't have stopped here," he whispered. I swallowed. I just need directions. My car, they saw you." A chill ran down my spine. "Who?" The old man slowly lifted a shaking hand and pointed past me, toward the window. I turned. Outside, just beyond the reach of the firelight, figures stood in the snow, tall, motionless, too many to count. Their faces were hidden in shadow, but I could feel them staring, watching. My breath came out in ragged gasps. What are they?" The old man's voice trembled. "They don't like when people come here." I turned back to him. "Who are you?" His lips barely moved as he whispered, "I was you." A long time ago. A sharp knock rattled the window. Then another, and another. The figures outside began to move. I didn't wait. I bolted for the door. But the old man's voice stopped me one last time. "If you run, they'll follow you forever." I didn't care. I threw open the door and ran into the storm. Snow blinded me, my feet slipping, my breath burning in my throat. But I didn't stop. I didn't dare look back. By some miracle, I made it to my car. I fumbled with the keys, hands numb, shoving them into the ignition. The engine roared to life. My headlights cut through the storm, and the road ahead was clear. The cabin was gone. No footprints, no figures, nothing. Just an empty stretch of road. But even now, when the snow falls heavy and the wind howls through the trees, I swear I can see them standing there, waiting. I grew up in the north, where snowstorms were just a part of life. But nothing could have prepared me for the night I got stranded on Black Hollow Road. I'd been driving for hours, trying to beat the worst of the storm. The snow came down in thick, blinding sheets, and my wipers barely made a difference. The road signs had disappeared under ice, and my GPS had lost signal miles ago. I should have turned back, but I was too stubborn. Then, my headlights caught something ahead, a figure walking alone in the snow. I slowed down, heart pounding. Who the hell would be out here in the middle of nowhere? As I got closer, I saw that it was a woman. She wore an old-fashioned dress, torn and stained, and her long black hair clung to her pale face. She walked slowly, barefoot, her arms wrapped around herself. I rolled down my window just a crack. "Hey, do you need help?" She stopped. Her head turned toward me, but her body stayed perfectly still. I couldn't see her face clearly through the snow, but something about her posture made my stomach twist. Then she smiled. Not a normal smile. Not a relieved or grateful smile. It was too wide, too wrong. I hit the gas. I didn't look back. I didn't care who she was or why she was. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to go. The road stretched on forever, the storm swallowing my car in darkness. My pulse slowly settled, my breath fogging up the windshield. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the cold was getting to me. Then my radio crackled. At first it was just static, but then, beneath the distortion, I heard it. A whisper. "You should have stopped." I nearly lost control of the car. My hands trembled on the wheel. The radio had been off. Then, the headlights flickered, and there she was, sitting in my back seat. I screamed. The car skidded. I yanked the wheel, barely avoiding the trees lining the road. My heart slammed against my ribs. When I dared to glance in the rearview mirror, she was gone, but the smell remained. Rotten, wet earth. I kept driving, faster, faster. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the storm broke. The sky opened, revealing a sliver of moonlight, and the road ended, not in a curve, not in a dead end, just nothing. A sheer drop into a frozen river below. I slammed the brakes, the tires skidding against the ice. My car teetered at the edge, the front wheels barely holding onto solid ground. My breath came in ragged gasps. If I had driven just a few seconds longer, I would have plummeted into the abyss. I threw the car into reverse, heart racing, and as I backed away, my headlights illuminated something carved into a tree nearby. "Don't pick her up." I didn't sleep that night. I barely made it back to civilization, my hands shaking the entire way. But ever since that night, I haven't been able to shake the feeling that I'm not alone, that in every shadow, every reflection, every dark road, she's waiting. I had never been afraid of the snow before. Growing up in Alaska, I was used to harsh winters and blizzards that could bury entire towns overnight. But what happened that night in the storm changed me forever. I was on my way to visit my uncle's cabin deep in the woods. The drive should have taken 2 hours, but the storm had turned the roads into a maze of white nothingness. My headlights barely cut through the snow, and my wipers struggled to keep up. I was alone out there, at least I thought I was. Then I saw it. At first, it looked like an old wooden structure on the side of the road, barely visible through the storm. As I got closer, I realized it was a bus stop, a single bench under a rickety shelter covered in snow, and someone was sitting there, a child. I slammed the brakes, my heart pounding. The little boy couldn't have been older than 6 or 7, wearing nothing but thin pajamas, his bare feet half buried in the snow. His head was tilted downward, his black hair hanging over his face. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me that something was wrong. No way a kid would be out here in this storm alone. I rolled down my window just enough to call out, "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" The boy didn't move. I looked around, expecting to see a house, a car, something, but there was nothing. Just an endless stretch of snow-covered trees. I felt sick. I couldn't just leave him there. Against every instinct, I stepped out of the car, the freezing wind slicing through my jacket. I took a few cautious steps forward. "Hey, buddy, where are your parents?" Slowly, he lifted his head, and I saw his face, his eyes, empty black pits, his mouth, too wide, stretching into a grin that wasn't human. His skin was pale, almost blue, frostbitten and peeling. Then he spoke. "You're late." The words sent ice down my spine. Before I could move, he stood up. The wind howled around us, and in that moment, the storm seemed to grow darker, heavier. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short gasps. What do you mean?" He stepped closer. "The bus is coming." A deep, low groan rumbled through the air, like metal scraping against ice. I turned toward the road. Headlight. A massive, old-fashioned bus emerged from the snow, its headlights glowing a dull yellow. It was covered in frost, its windows dark. No driver, no passenger, just waiting. The boy turned back to me. "You have to get on now." I didn't think. I ran. I scrambled back to my car, my hands fumbling with the door handle. The engine roared to life as I slammed it into reverse, tires spinning against the ice. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. In the rearview mirror, I saw the bus doors creak open. The boy stepped inside. Then, the door slammed shut, and the bus faded into the storm, vanished. I didn't stop driving until I reached my uncle's cabin, my body shaking from something much worse than the cold. I told him what I saw. His face went pale. He took a deep breath and said, "That bus comes through here every few years, always in a storm, and if you get on, you never come back." I didn't sleep that night, but sometimes when the snow falls heavy and the roads disappear, I still hear it. That deep, low groan of an engine rolling through the storm. I was never one to believe in ghosts or the supernatural, but after that night, I can never look at a snowstorm the same way again. It happened when I took a seasonal job as a caretaker for a remote lodge in the mountains. The owners only used it in the summer, but during the winter, someone had to stay behind to make sure the pipes didn't freeze and that the place wasn't buried under snow. It sounded like an easy gig, solitude, fresh air, and a decent paycheck. I was wrong. The first few weeks were fine. The lodge was old but sturdy, and I had stocked up on food and firewood. The nearest town was miles away, but I had a radio for emergency. The storms came often, but I was used to it. Until the night I heard the knocking. It was past midnight, and the wind was howling outside. I was in the living room reading when I heard it. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the front door. Boom, boom, boom. I froze. No one should have been out here. Not in this. I grabbed a flashlight and approached the door, my pulse hammering in. "Hello?" I called out. No answer. Just the wind shrieking against the walls. I hesitated, then unlocked the door and pulled it open. No one was there. The snow was untouched. No footprints, no signs of anyone at all. Just a swirling, endless white. I slammed the door shut, locking it tight. That should have been the end of it. But the knocking came again. Boom, boom, boom. Louder this time. I grabbed my shotgun. My hands were sweating despite the cold. "Who's there?" Silence. Then, soft laughter. Not outside. Behind me. I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my grip. The living room was empty, the fire crackling in the hearth. But something was wrong. The temperature had dropped. My breath fogged in the air. And then I saw it. A single wet footprint in the middle of the wooden floor. I ran. I locked myself in the bedroom, shoving the dresser against the door. I clutched the shotgun, my ears straining for any sound. Then, the whispering began. It came from everywhere and nowhere, faint voices murmuring just beyond the edge of understanding. The walls creaked. The wind outside grew into a howling scream. Then, the knocks came again, not from the front door, from inside the room. Boom, 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 right behind me. I turned slowly. The closet door stood slightly ajar, darkness spilling from within. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The door creaked open wider. A hand, pale, frozen, reached out. I bolted. I don't remember how I got out. I don't remember running through the storm or making it to my truck. All I know is that I found myself miles away, shivering and half frozen, when the sun finally rose. I never went back. Days later, the lodge's owners called me, angry that I had abandoned my post. I told them everything. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, the owner sighed. "You should have never opened the door." They never explained what they meant. But I know one thing. Something was in that lodge, and it was waiting for me to let it in. I used to love winter. The way the snow blanketed everything, the silence of the world, buried beneath white. But after what happened that night, I dread the cold, because I know what hides in it. It was late December when I got stranded on a desolate highway in the middle of a snowstorm. I was heading home after visiting my parents for Christmas, taking the back roads to avoid traffic. It was supposed to be a 4-hour drive. It turned into a nightmare. The storm had been unpredictable, growing stronger by the minute, until my windshield wipers couldn't keep up. The road signs disappeared under the thick snow, and soon, I wasn't even sure I was still on the right path. Then, my car started sputtering. The temperature gauge shot up. The engine died. Panic set in. I was alone miles from the nearest town with no cell service. I tried restarting the car. Nothing. Then, in the rearview mirror, I saw something. A figure standing in the storm. My stomach twisted. I hadn't seen another car for hours. No one should have been out here. But there they were, just barely visible, swirling snow. I turned, straining to see. The figure was tall, draped in something tattered and dark, its face obscured by the blizzard. I reached for my phone. No signal. I turned back to the windshield. The figure was closer. I locked the doors, my breath fogging up the glass. It had moved at an impossible speed. I couldn't see its face, only the outline of its head tilting slightly, as if studying me. Then, it raised a hand and knocked. Boom, boom, boom. The entire car shook. My heart pounded. I couldn't move. The figure leaned closer. Through the frost-covered window, I saw it clearly now. Its face wasn't human. The skin was stretched too tight, pale and cracked like old leather. Its eyes were hollow pits, endless and black, and then it smiled. I don't remember screaming, but my throat burned. My hands fumbled with the keys trying to turn the ignition. The car wouldn't start. Boom! 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 The pounding grew louder, more insistent. Then, the passenger door handle twisted. I scrambled, reaching for anything, but my hands were frozen stiff. Click! The door unlocked. I don't know how. I didn't touch it. The door creaked open. A blast of frigid air filled the car, and the figure began to crawl inside. I lunged for the handle, slamming the door shut with all my strength. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a whisper. Let me in. The voice didn't come from outside. It came from the back seat. I didn't look. I couldn't. I just grabbed the keys, twisted them with everything I had. The engine roared to life. I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires skidding on the ice. I didn't care where I was going. I just had to get away. The road blurred. The storm howled, and in the rearview mirror, I saw it, sitting in the back seat, grinning. I must have blacked out because the next thing I knew, I was in a ditch, headlights illuminating the trees. The car was empty. The storm had passed. I stumbled out, gasping, scanning the area. Nothing. No footprints. No sign that anyone had been there. But as I climbed back into the car, something caught my eye. On the inside of the frost-covered window, written in smeared ice, were two words, "See you." Winter storms have always carried a strange kind of silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that feels like something is listening, watching, waiting. I learned this the hard way. I was working as a security guard at a power station in the middle of nowhere. It was a dull job, mostly sitting in a small guardhouse, watching the monitors and checking IDs of the occasional worker coming in for maintenance. The company insisted someone be on site 24/7, even though nothing ever happened. Then came the blizzard. It was the worst one in years. By midnight, the wind was howling like a living thing, shaking the walls of the guardhouse. Snow piled high against the windows, nearly blocking my view. That's when the power flickered. The screens in front of me glowed weakly before cutting to static. The security cameras, my only eyes on the outside, went dark, and then I heard it. A knock at the door. Boom, boom, boom. I froze. There shouldn't have been anyone out there. The nearest town was miles away, and no workers were scheduled to be on site. I grabbed my flashlight and hesitated before opening the door. Snow and wind blasted inside. No one was there. I stepped outside, my boots crunching in the fresh snow. I shined my light around, nothing. But as I turned to go back inside, I noticed something. Footprints, a single set leading up to the door. No prints leading away. My stomach twisted. I slammed the door shut and locked it. I told myself it was just the storm messing, maybe ice shifting against the walls. Then I turned back to the monitors. They were on again, but the feeds weren't normal. Each screen showed a different angle of the power station, the snowy roads, the generator building, the fences, and on every single one of them, the same thing. A figure, tall, motionless, standing just beyond the reach of the floodlights. I couldn't see its face. It was always just out of focus, its shape blurred by the storm. But it was there, watching. Then, the radio crackled to life. A voice whispered through the static. "You shouldn't be here." The power went out. I was plunged into darkness, my breath coming in quick gasps. My flashlight flickered as I spun in circles, trying to see if someone was inside with me. Then, the knocking came again. Boom, boom, boom. Not from the door, from the window. I turned slowly. Something was on the other side of the glass. A hand, pale, thin, pressing against the frost-covered pane. Long fingers splayed wide, nails too sharp. The outline of a face just behind it, its breath fogging up the glass. Then, in the condensation, it began to write. "Let me in." I ran. I didn't stop to grab my jacket or my keys. I just threw open the door and sprinted into the storm. I don't remember how long I ran. Hours, maybe minutes. The cold bit into my skin, but I didn't care. I had to get away. When I finally saw headlights, I collapsed in front of a snowplow, screaming for help. The driver took me into town. I told him what had happened. He gave me a strange look and said, "That place has been abandoned for years. No one's worked there since the accident." I didn't ask what accident. I didn't want to know. I just know one thing. Something was in that guardhouse and it wanted me to stay. I never should have taken that shortcut. It was a reckless decision, but the storm had come out of nowhere, and I was desperate to get home. The highway was a gridlocked mess, so I turned onto an old back road cutting through the woods. It wasn't on my Jeep, but I figured as long as I was heading in the right direction, I'd be fine. I wasn't. The snow piled up fast, and soon my tires were slipping. The road was narrow, winding between tall, skeletal trees, their branches heavy with ice. There were no streetlights, no signs, just an endless stretch of white. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the road. I slammed the brakes, my car skidding slightly before coming to a stop just feet away. My heart pounded as I squinted through the frost-covered windshield. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was wearing an old-fashioned coat, long and black, the kind people wore 100 years ago. His face was obscured by the swirling snow, but I could see he was thin, too thin. He didn't move, didn't react to the fact that I had almost run him over. I hesitated before honking the horn. The sound echoed through the empty woods. The figure lifted his head slightly. Then he smiled. I don't know why, but that smile sent a jolt of pure terror through me. It was wrong. Stretched too wide, teeth too white against his frozen skin. Then he started walking toward my car. I panicked. I threw the car into reverse, but the tires spun uselessly in the thick snow. The man kept coming. His steps were slow, deliberate, his eyes locked onto mine through the windshield. Then he raised his hand and knocked. Boom, boom, boom. The entire car shook. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers numb with fear. No signal. Then the passenger door handle turned. I screamed, slamming my hand on the lock button. The man didn't react. He just kept smiling, kept knocking, his fingers leaving wet streaks on the glass. Boom, boom, boom. And then he vanished. 1 second he was there. The next, he was gone. The road was empty. The snow-covered trees stood silent. I didn't wait. I kept my foot on the gas until the car finally lurched backward, my tires finding traction. I reversed blindly, not caring where I was going, just away from that spot. Then I saw something in my rearview mirror. Not the man. Footprints, dozens of, surrounding my car. They hadn't been there before, and they weren't leading away. I didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station miles down the road. I stumbled inside, breathless and shaking. The attendant looked at me strangely. Did you come from the old back road? He asked. I nodded. He sighed, shaking his head. You should have stayed on the highway. I asked him why. He just pointed to an old newspaper clipping pinned to the wall. The headline sent ice through my veins. Missing travelers found frozen on back road. Smiling corpses baffle authorities. The picture showed the same man I'd seen in the road. Same black coat, same too wide grin. I never took a shortcut again. I was staying at my uncle's cabin for the weekend, a last-minute decision to escape the noise of the city. It was supposed to be peaceful, just me, the snow, and the quiet. But the quiet was the problem. The cabin sat deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. It had no Wi-Fi, no TV, and only a wood-burning stove for heat. I liked the solitude at first. The snowstorm rolled in that evening, covering everything in a thick white blanket, and for a while, I sat by the fire, enjoying the stillness. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard it, a knock at the door. Boom, boom, boom. I froze. No one should have been out there. The storm had made the roads impassable, and I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived. Boom, boom, boom. I crept to the door, my breath fogging in the cold air. There was no peephole, so I had to ask, hello? Silence. I waited, my heart pounding. Then, against my better judgment, I unlatched the door and cracked it open just an inch. Nothing. Just the storm howling through the trees, snow swirling in the dim light from the porch lamp. No footprints. Then, why did I still feel like something was there? I shut the door and locked it, convincing myself I had imagined it. Maybe a branch had hit the cabin. Maybe the wind had shaken something loose. Then I heard it again. Not at the door, at the window. Tap, tap, tap. Slow, rhythmic, too deliberate to be. I turned, my stomach twisting. Something was outside. Through the frost-covered glass, I could make out the shape of a figure just beyond the reach of the porch light. Tall, thin, still. I couldn't see its face. Tap, tap, tap. I backed away, my mind racing. There was no way someone had hiked through the storm just to knock on my window. Then I saw it. The thing didn't cast a shadow. I grabbed the fire poker and ran to the back room, locking the door behind me. My pulse thundered in my ears as I pressed myself against the wall, waiting, listening. For a long time, there was nothing. Just the wind outside, the crackling of the fire in the other room. Then, ever so softly, a whisper, right outside the window. Let me in. I shut my eyes. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The whisper came again, closer. Let me in. Then, scratching, slow, deliberate scraping against the glass. My chest ached from holding my breath. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. And then, silence. I don't know how long I sat there shaking, waiting for the sound to but when the sun finally rose, I forced myself to open the door and check outside. There were no footprints in the snow. No signs that anyone had been there at all. But on the window pane, drawn in long, jagged scratches, were 3 words: I saw you. I packed my bags and left them. I don't know what was out there in the storm that night, and I never want to find out. I always thought of myself as a rational person, a man of logic, science, facts. That belief shattered on the night I got lost in the snowstorm. It started as a simple mistake: an unfamiliar road, heavy snowfall, and my overconfidence in my truck's ability to handle rough terrain. I was heading to my friend's cabin for a weekend getaway, but somewhere along the way I must have taken a wrong turn. My GPS lost signal, my phone was nearly dead, and the storm grew worse by the minute. Soon, I was driving blind. The snow was relentless, swirling in thick waves across the road. My headlights barely cut through the darkness. Every tree looked the same. I had no idea where I was. Then I saw the house. A single-story cabin, barely visible through the storm, its windows dark. It stood in the middle of a clearing, the only structure I had seen for miles. My relief was instant. I'd find shelter, maybe even someone who could give me directions. I pulled into the driveway, tires crunching over ice, and stepped out of the truck. The cold was brutal, seeping into my bones almost instantly. I hurried to the front door and knocked. No answer. I knocked again, harder this. Hello, is anyone home? Still nothing. I should have left right then. But the wind howled through the trees, and the idea of sitting in my truck all night didn't seem like an option. So I tried the door. It opened. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and something else, something faintly metallic. The cabin was small, just a few rooms, with old wooden furniture and a fireplace filled with cold ash. A single oil lamp sat on the table, and when I lit it, the flickering glow revealed something that made my stomach tighten. There were plates on the table, half-eaten meals, dust-covered cups. It looked like whoever had been here left in a hurry and never came back. And yet, the front door had been unlocked. A deep unease settled in my chest, but I tried to ignore it. I told myself that whoever owned the cabin had simply abandoned it, that I was alone. But then I heard a noise, a soft creak like a footstep on old wooden floors. My breath caught in my throat. The sound had come from the hallway leading to the back rooms. I wasn't alone. I turned slowly, the oil lamp trembling in my grip. Hello? Silence. Then, just as I took a step forward, a whisper, faint, drawn out. You shouldn't be here. The lamp flickered violently, and every nerve in my body screamed at me to run. But I couldn't move. My eyes locked onto the hallway where the darkness seemed to shift, and then I saw it. A shape, a figure, standing just beyond the reach of the lamplight. Too tall, too thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if observing me. I bolted. I ran out of the cabin, stumbling through the snow, barely making it to my truck before I heard the door behind me creak open. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The engine roared to life, and I reversed so fast that I nearly slid off the road. My hands were shaking. My heart pounded against my ribs. I didn't stop driving until I reached the highway, where the storm had eased just enough for me to find my way. The next day, I told my friend about the cabin. He frowned. There's no cabin out there, he said. I laughed it off, thinking he was messing with me. But when I tried to find the road again, when I retraced every turn, every landmark, there was nothing. No clearing, no house, just an endless stretch of snow-covered trees. I don't know where I was that night. I don't know what I saw, and I don't think I ever want to find out. I was driving home late at night when the snowstorm hit harder than I expected. The road ahead blurred into a swirling white abyss, and the only thing keeping me grounded was the rhythmic hum of my tires cutting through the snow. I had taken this route dozens of times before, a lonely stretch of road winding through miles of forest. But that night, it felt different. The trees loomed taller. The silence between gusts of wind stretched longer. My headlights barely cut through the thick snowfall. Then, I saw him. A man standing on the side of the road, his figure barely visible through the flurry. He wasn't waving for help. He wasn't even moving, just standing there, watching. I slowed down slightly, my heart picking up speed. Something about him felt wrong. He was too still, too rigid. As I passed, my headlights illuminated his face for just a second. Not his face, his lack of one. His features were blurred, faded, like a smudged painting. I pressed the gas pedal harder. My truck roared forward, tires slipping slightly over the icy road. I didn't look back. I didn't want to. For the next few miles, I tried to shake the feeling that something was behind me, that if I dared to glance in my rearview mirror, I'd see him standing in the middle of the road, closer. The tension in my chest only eased when I saw the familiar turn leading toward my neighborhood. The storm was still raging, but I was almost home. I'd shake this off, get some sleep, and laugh about it in the morning. But as I pulled into my driveway, I froze. There, standing at the edge of my yard, barely visible through the falling snow, the man, the exact same man, standing motionless, staring. I ran inside and locked every door, every window. My heart was hammering so hard, I could barely hear anything. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him standing there, waiting. By morning, he was gone, but in the fresh snow outside my house, leading from the road directly to my window, footprints, deep, unwavering, like someone had stood there for hours, just watching. I never drove that road at night again. I'd been working late at the hospital. By the time I clocked out, the snowstorm had transformed the world outside into a white void. The roads were nearly deserted, blanketed in a thick layer of fresh snow. It would be a slow, careful drive home. As I navigated the lonely road through the forest, my headlights struggled to cut through the swirling flurries. I kept my hands steady on the wheel, my breath fogging up the windshield despite the heat blasting inside the car. Then, in the distance, I saw something, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slowed down, my pulse quickening. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer, maybe. But as I got closer, I realized it was a person, a woman. She was barefoot, dressed in a thin nightgown that clung to her frail frame, her skin nearly as pale as the snow around her. Long, dark hair hung in tangled strands over her face, obscuring her features. She didn't move. I rolled down my window slightly, my voice shaking. "Ma'am, do you need help?" No response. The woman just stood there, her head slightly tilted, her body eerily motionless despite the howling wind. My stomach twisted. I should have driven away. Every instinct told me to keep going, but I couldn't leave her out here. I put the car in park, grabbed my coat, and stepped into the freezing night. The cold bit through my clothes instantly, and I shivered as I approached her, my boots crunching in the deep snow. "Are you lost?" I asked, my breath coming in rapid puffs. "Do you need a ride somewhere?" Still, she didn't respond. Then, as I got closer, I saw her lips move, whispering. Her voice was too soft to hear over the wind. I hesitated but leaned in slightly, and then she stopped. A deep, unnatural silence fell around us. The storm seemed to pause. The trees stopped swaying. The air itself felt wrong. Then she lifted her head. Her face, oh God. Her eyes were gone. Just empty, dark sockets, sunken and endless. Her mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, her teeth jagged and too large for her face. I stumbled backward, my heart slamming against my ribs. The woman's neck jerked unnaturally as she took a step toward me, her bare feet sinking into the snow without making a sound. I turned and ran. I barely made it back to my car, fumbling with the door handle as my hands shook violently. I slammed it shut, locked it, and threw the car into reverse. As my tires spun in the snow, I looked up. She was gone, vanished. The road ahead was empty. I didn't stop until I reached my house. I locked every door, closed every curtain, and sat in my living room with the lights on until the sun came up. The next morning, I convinced myself I had imagined it. That exhaustion and the storm had played tricks on me. But when I stepped outside to grab the newspaper, my blood ran cold. In the fresh snow, leading from the road to my front door, bare footprints, and at the very bottom of my porch steps, a single strand of long, dark hair. I was house-sitting for my uncle while he was out of town. His place was isolated, nestled deep in the woods, and that night, a snowstorm had buried everything in white. The wind howled through the trees, and the world outside felt distant, swallowed by the storm. I had just settled into the living room with a blanket and a cup of tea when I heard it, a knock. It was faint, but unmistakable. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the front door. I froze. No one should be out here. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the roads were nearly impassable. I set my cup down and approached the door cautiously. Peeking through the peephole, I saw nothing but the swirling snow. Maybe it was just the wind, but then 3 more knocks, louder this. A sick feeling twisted in my gut. My uncle had a doorbell. Why would someone knock instead? I hesitated before calling out. "Hello? Who's there?" Silence. Then a voice, soft, barely audible. "Let me in." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the cold. Something about that voice felt off. It wasn't a plea, it wasn't desperate. It was flat, emotional. I didn't respond. I backed away from the door, my pulse pounding. Then the knocking started again. Faster, harder. Bang! 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 The entire door rattled in its frame. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed the biggest knife I could find, and ducked behind the counter. My breaths came in short, sharp gasps. The knocking had stopped, but the silence was worse. I waited. Minutes passed. Then, scraping. Something dragged across the walls outside. Slow, deliberate. A sound like nails or claws. Raking. I clenched the knife tighter, forcing me still. Then, from the back of the house, a whisper. So close, too close. "Let me in." I nearly dropped the knife. The voice wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was inside. I turned my head ever so slightly. The hallway was dark, empty, but the whisper came again. Closer. I didn't wait. I bolted for my room, slamming the door and locking it behind me. I pressed my back against the wall, my ears straining for any sound. Nothing. Then, a single knock, right on my bedroom door. My vision blurred with panic. My hands trembled as I gripped my phone and dialed 911. "Please," I whispered. "Someone's in my house." The operator's voice was calm. "Stay where you are. Officers are on their way." I barely heard her. My focus was on the door, on the shadow beneath. Something was standing there, waiting. Then it moved, not away, under. The shadow stretched unnaturally, seeping through the gap like liquid. I screamed, then silence. The next thing I remember is waking up to flashing red and blue lights outside. The police broke down the door and found me curled up in the corner of my room, shaking. The house was empty. No signs of forced entry, no footprints in the snow. Just the front door, wide open, as if someone had finally let themselves in. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend at my family's old cabin deep in the woods. Just me, a few books, and the peaceful silence of a snow-covered forest. But by the second night, the storm outside had grown so intense that I could barely see past the windows. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the walls, filling the cabin with eerie shifting shadows. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard it. Footsteps in the snow, faint at first, barely noticeable over the wind. But soon, they became distinct, crunching, deliberate steps circling the cabin. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. There shouldn't be anyone out there. The nearest town was miles away, and I hadn't seen a single car on the road when I arrived. I turned off the lamp, letting the darkness swallow me. Heart pounding, I crept to the window and peeked outside. At first, I saw nothing, just the endless white of the storm. But then, in the dim moonlight, a figure, standing just beyond the tree line, not moving, watching. I swallowed hard, my hands gripping the curtain. It was impossible to make out any detail, just the vague outline of a person, their heads slightly tilted as if listening. Then, before I could react, they took a step closer. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a chair. My mind raced. Who the hell would be out here in the middle of a blizzard? I grabbed my phone and quickly dialed 911. No signal. A chill crawled down my spine, colder than the wind outside. The footsteps started again, slow, dragging steps moving toward the front door. Then, a knock, software, rhythmic. Knock, knock, knock. I held my breath, heart hammering against my ribs. Then, a voice, low, crooked, like something imitating a human. Let me in. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to run, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped. The knock came again, harder, more insistent. Let me in. I backed away, my eyes locked on the door. I didn't dare answer. Then, after a long pause, the knob twisted, slowly. I grabbed the fireplace poker, gripping it so tightly my knuckles turned white. My pulse thundered in my ears as I prepared for the worst. Then, silence. The wind continued to howl, the walls groaning under the weight of the storm. But the knocking had stopped. I forced myself to move, inching toward the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the peephole. I hesitated. Then, finally, I looked. Nothing. Just an empty, snow-covered porch. No footprints. No sign that anyone had ever been there. I locked every door and window and sat in the corner of the cabin, poker in hand, waiting for the sun to rise. When I finally dared to open the door the next morning, I expected to see some sign of the visitor, but there was only fresh, undisturbed snow, except for one thing. On the porch, right where the knocking had come from, a single perfect handprint, twisted, elongated, pressed deep into the frozen wood. I had taken a winter job as a caretaker for an old hunting lodge deep in the Montana wilderness. The owner had left for the season, leaving me alone with nothing but a radio, a stockpile of firewood, and the endless, frozen silence of the snow-covered forest. It was peaceful at first, isolating but peaceful. That changed on the third night. I woke up to the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a coyote straying too close to the cabin. But the sound was too deliberate, slow, heavy, human. I rolled out of bed and crept to the window, careful not to make a sound. The storm had cleared, leaving behind an eerily bright night. The moon cast long shadows over the snow, and that's when I saw them. Footprints. A single set of deep, fresh tracks leading from the woods, stopping just a few feet from my window. But there was no one there. My breath hitched. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass, scanning the tree line. The forest was still, silent. Nothing moved. Then, knock, knock, knock. I nearly jumped out of my skin. It came from the front door. Slow, measured knocks that sent a shiver through my spine. I turned, my pulse hammering in my ears. Knock, knock, knock. I took a deep breath. There was no reason to panic. Maybe it was a lost traveler, someone stranded in the cold. I approached the door cautiously, calling out, "Hello? Who's there?" No answer. Knock, knock, knock. Louder this time. Something about it felt wrong. I reached for the rifle mounted by the door. my fingers wrapping around the cold steel. If someone was playing games, I wasn't in the mood. I peered through the peephole. Nothing. Just the empty porch, the fresh snow undisturbed. I felt a sinking dread in my stomach. Slowly, I unbolted the rifle and took a step back. The knocking stopped. I held my breath, my finger resting on the trigger. The silence stretched. Then, from behind me, a whisper. Let me in. I spun around so fast I nearly dropped the gun. The cabin was empty, but something felt different. The air was colder, heavier. The radio crackled suddenly, static hissing through the silence. Then, a voice, distorted. You should have opened the door. I stumbled backward, my heart nearly stopping. The voice was mine. I grabbed the radio, yanking the cord from the wall. The static died. The cabin fell into silence once more, but the whisper returned, right behind me. Let me in. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out. The next morning, I woke up on the floor, the rifle still clutched in my hands. The door was locked. The snow outside was untouched. But when I checked the radio, the cord was still plugged in, and the last thing it had broadcasted was my own voice. I took a job at a remote gas station off a lonely stretch of highway, miles from the nearest town. It was the dead of winter, and the station barely saw customers at night. My only company was the buzzing fluorescent lights, the old radio playing static-filled country music, and the endless snowfall outside. The first night was uneventful. The second night, I noticed something strange. The security cameras kept glitching. At first, I chalked it up to the storm. The wind howled outside, and the snow piled against the windows. But every few minutes, the monitors would flicker, just for a second, and I'd see something, a figure, standing at the edge of the lot. It was always the same spot, just beyond the reach of the station's lights. At first, I thought it was a trick of the snow, maybe a shadow shifting in the wind. But every time the cameras glitched, the figure was unmoving, watching. I stepped outside, the freezing air cutting into my lungs. The gas station was silent except for the distant whine of the wind. There was no one there, no footprints in the snow. I went back inside, locking the door behind me, but the cameras kept glitching, and every time they did, the figure was closer. By 2 a.m., it was at the edge of the pumps, a tall, blurred silhouette, like something caught between existence and static. I grabbed the baseball bat we kept under the counter and stepped toward the door, my heart pounding. I could feel something watching me, pressing against the edges of reality. Then, the power cut out. The lights, the radio, the cameras, everything. I was plunged into pitch-black silence. I fumbled for my phone, the screen barely illuminating the aisles of snacks and empty shelves. I could hear my own breathing, shaky, fast. Then, a soft knock at the window. I turned slowly. A face was pressed against the glass, but it wasn't a person. Its features were smeared, like a reflection in a broken mirror. Its mouth stretched too wide, eyes too hollow. It didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at me through the glass. Then, the power came. The lights flickered on. The radio crackled. The cameras hummed back to life. I whipped around, heart hammering. The figure was gone. The snow outside was untouched. No footprints. No sign that anything had been there. But when I checked the security footage, the glitches were gone, except for one frame. Paused on the monitor, distorted by static, the figure, standing right behind me. I was hired as a night security guard for an abandoned ski lodge deep in the mountains. It had been closed for years, after a series of unexplained accidents, but the new owner planned to renovate it. My job was simple: watch the place overnight, make sure no squatters or animals got inside. The first night was quiet, just the hum of the space heater, the occasional creak of the old wooden beams, and the snowstorm howling outside. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard something. Footsteps, slow, cautious, coming from the second floor. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the staircase, calling out, "Anyone here?" No response. The air felt heavier as I climbed the steps. The hallway was long, lined with old doors, each leading to a different room. The footsteps had stopped, but I could feel something watching me. Then, a door creaked open. I swung the flashlight toward the sound. Room 206. The door had been locked when I checked earlier. Now it stood slightly ajar. I hesitated, then stepped inside. The room was empty, just dusty furniture covered in white sheets. But something felt wrong. The closet door was open, and inside, a pair of boots, old, worn, covered in dried mud. But they weren't there before. I backed away slowly, my pulse hammering. The air in the room grew colder, my breath visible in the beam of my flashlight. Then, behind me, a whisper. "Get out." I spun around, but there was no one there. The lights flickered. Then, the closet door slammed shut. I ran, down the hall, down the stairs, straight to the main lobby. My hands trembled as I grabbed my radio, but The signal was nothing but static. Then, a knock at the window. I turned slowly. Outside, barely visible through the snow, stood a figure, dressed in an old ski patrol uniform. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, his neck twisted like something had snapped it. He lifted a hand and pointed at me. The power cut out. The emergency lights flickered on, casting long, eerie shadows, and when I looked back at the window, the figure was gone. But in the frost on the glass, a single word was run. I quit the next morning. I was driving through a remote mountain road late at night, trying to make it home before the snowstorm got worse. The highway was empty. No cars, no lights, just miles of twisting roads, surrounded by dark, towering trees. Then, my headlights hit something up ahead. A car, half buried in snow, sitting at an odd angle in a ditch on the side of the road. Its hazard lights were flashing weakly, barely visible through the heavy snowfall. As I got closer, I saw someone standing beside it. A woman. She was wearing a thin, tattered dress, completely wrong for the freezing weather. Her long, dark hair was wet, clinging to her pale skin. She didn't wave me down, didn't move, just stood there, staring. I slowed down, rolling down my window slightly. "Hey, do you need help?" No response. The snow swirled around her, her bare arms trembling. Something about her felt off. The way she stood, perfectly still, unblinking, like she wasn't even real. A bad feeling crawled up my spine. I decided to keep driving. As I passed, I stole one last glance at her through my side mirror. She was gone. The car, the flashing lights, gone, like they had never been there at all. I pressed down on the gas, my heart racing. The snowstorm thickened, the road disappearing into white. Then, a thump on my roof. I slammed on the brakes. Silence. Then, a slow scraping sound. Something was moving on top of my car, crawling. I held my breath, my hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Then, in the rearview mirror, a face, pressed against the glass, mouth too wide, eyes too empty, smiling. I floored it, speeding through the snow, gripping the wheel as my car fishtailed on the icy road. The weight on my roof shifted. The scraping grew louder. Then, nothing. The road stretched empty ahead of me. No sound except my own ragged breathing. I didn't stop until I reached town. The next morning, I told a local what had happened. He went pale, said I wasn't the first. People had seen her before, always on that road, always in the snow. She was never real, but if you stop, she gets in. I was on my way to visit my parents for the holidays, driving through a backroad shortcut to save time. The forecast warned of a snowstorm, but I figured I could make it before things got too bad. I was wrong. The snow thickened fast, turning the road into a white void. My high beams barely cut through it, and my GPS kept rerouting. No signal, no road sign, just endless snow and trees. Then, through the swirling frost, I saw it. A house. A small wooden cabin, its windows dark, sitting just off the road. A single lantern flickered on the porch. I didn't remember passing any houses, but I was lost, and I needed to get my bearings. I pulled up and honked. No answer. The place looked abandoned. No tracks in the snow, no sign of life. But as I stepped onto the porch, the front door creaked open, like it had been waiting for me. Inside, the air was warm. A fire crackled in the hearth. A plate of food sat on the table, half eaten, as if someone had just left. "Hello?" I called out. No response. Then, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, heart hammering. The storm howled outside, rattling the windows. Something about the house felt wrong. The walls were covered in old, yellowed newspaper clippings. Missing persons. All from this area. All lost in snowstorm. Then I saw the photographs. Dozens of them. Nailed to the walls. Faces frozen in terror. Mouths open in silent screams. I stepped back, my breath shallow. The floor creaked under my weight. And that's when I heard it. A whisper from the hallway. A slow, rasping breath just beyond the doorframe. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I bolted for the door, yanking it open. The storm nearly knocked me off my feet, but I ran to my car, scrambling inside and locking the doors. My headlights illuminated the cabin, and in the window, a face, gaunt, hollow eyes, watching me, smiling. I hit the gas. Snow whipped around me, the house disappearing into the storm. My hands were shaking, my pulse pounding. Finally, I found the main road again. The snow started to clear, like the storm had never been there at all. When I reached town, I asked about the cabin. The bartender gave me a strange look. "There's no cabin on that road," he said. "There was," I insisted. "I saw it. I was inside." He shook his head. "That place burned down years ago. After a family went missing inside, they never found their bodies." I didn't say anything else. But as I walked back to my car, I noticed something in the snow. Footprints leading from the woods, stopping right at my driver's side door.